Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining in this National Farmers Union webinar on advocating for cooperatives. Today's event is part of a series of online gatherings that help to educate us all about the value and importance of the cooperative business model. We here at NFU are big fans of cooperatives, and we're joined by some panelists today who are as well. We're also glad that you could be here and you can take part in this project today, and we appreciate your time. I'm Mike Strands. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for National Farmers Union, and I'm coming to you from the office here in Washington, D.C. I'm joined on this call, but off screen, by two of my colleagues, and I want to thank them for their good work in getting this all ready today. Emma Lindberg, Farmers Union's Education Director, and Charlie Michael, NFU's Education and Outreach Coordinator. Thanks to you both for your work in bringing this together. And then on screen, I'm joined by today's panelists, Marlis Carson from the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, and Paul Gutierrez from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Before we go any further, I wanted to offer up a few housekeeping items. We've set aside time at the end of today's session for our panelists to answer questions related to the topics covered in their presentations. So if you have any questions during their remarks, please enter those questions into the Q&A box on your screen. Entries there are public and can be read by panelists or other participants. In fact, all chats, both public and private on this, will be recorded. We hope to answer any leftover questions in future webinars or blogs or other publications from Farmers Union. So even if your question isn't answered today, we'll do our best to get you an answer. If you need technical assistance, please, again, use the chat box to contact the host. Emma and Charlie can help out, and I'll do what I can as well. This webinar is designed to keep everyone muted so that that'll prevent audio feedback that might otherwise be distracting. So the best way to communicate with the panelists and staff is through the chat box or Q&A. Also, if you find this session to be really interesting, or you learn something that you want to share with your friends, family, colleagues, or neighbors, we are recording the program, so it will be available after the session concludes online, and you can send it along that way. So yeah, that's the housekeeping issues that we had to bring up, but now let's move on more to today's discussion. On the screen here, I think I'm sharing the Farmers Union Triangle. It represents the organization's core principles. And as it works out, we're really going to talk about all three of them in the next hour or so. Well, first in the middle of the triangle, you see Farmers Union insignia that dates back decades. The plow, the rake, and the hoe. These three implements of husbandry symbolize the tools and implements that farmers needed back when the organization was founded in 1902. In fact, the official name of National Farmers Union is actually the Farmers Educational and Cooperative Union of America. So shouldn't be a surprise that right at the base of the triangle lies education, and on the sides you see cooperation and legislation. So it's these two ideas that family farmers are better off when we have improved legislative efforts or cooperation amongst farmers. That provides for a better future for our members, our family farmers, ranchers, and rural residents across the country. So in order to better advocate for co-ops, particularly on a federal level, it's good for people to remember that the unique structure and purpose of co-ops and how that is so unique and at the core of many of our organizations. After all, co-ops exist to provide a service to member owners rather than profits to shareholders. Now, there's many different kinds of co-ops out there, and many of you represent those organizations or are members of co-ops. There's a set of principles that co-ops are governed by. You can see them on screen here, but open and voluntary membership, democratic member control, members' economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for community. traditional other forms of businesses like sole proprietorships, partnerships, corporations, or other business forms aren't generally led by these ideas. And co-ops, on the other hand, have a very specific difference. They have a set of principles that runs and kind of guides their operation. And because they're different, sometimes when there's broad federal legislation, there can be unintended or ill-advised consequences for co-ops. And that can affect all of our livelihoods as farmers, as members of the community, as customers. So our panelists today will discuss a few of these situations that have happened recently. I think the finer points of these legislative efforts that both Paul and Marlis have tackled can show us how we can all be better advocates for co-ops. So yes, we'll discuss how co-ops and their representatives were able to overcome these challenges, particularly related to federal tax policy. This will help us to be better prepared the next time co-ops face legislative adversity. So with that, I'll take us to our panelists here. First off, I'd like to introduce Marlis Carson, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the National Council of Farmer Co-ops, based here in Washington, D.C., actually just down the street. In addition to overseeing NCFC's legal, financial, and tax compliance issues, Marlis coordinates the activities of the committee that handles those topics on federal issues impacting farmer co-ops. She also serves as NCFC's corporate secretary and treasurer. Prior to joining NCFC, Marlis served as the tax manager for Ernst & Young's National Tax Department. She grew up in Kansas and is a graduate of Sterling College and the George Washington University Law School. She's a member of the Virginia Bar, State Bar. I'll also introduce our second panelist, Paul Gutierrez, Senior Principal at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, or NRECA, where he's worked as a lobbyist since 2014. His main areas of responsibility include legislative and regulatory policy strategies, along with outreach and working with coalitions for taxes and transportation. Paul has worked both in Washington, D.C. and New Mexico as a political appointee and government relations professional. For 6 years, he served as the executive director for the New Mexico Association of Counties. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at USDA and was the state director for both rural development and farm service agencies in New Mexico. Also, he's worked as Deputy Director of International Programs and Intergovernmental Affairs at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission in Bethesda, Maryland. Paul is a native of Magdalena, New Mexico, where he grew up on a cow-calf ranch and small farming operation. He earned a bachelor's degree in Ag Econ from New Mexico State University. So thank you to both of our panelists for joining us today. I look forward to your comments on how some recent federal tax policy impacted co-ops and what you were both able to do to overcome those challenges. So with that, Marlis, I think you're up first.
Yes, thanks, Mike. And thanks for inviting me to speak to your group. Always appreciate the opportunity to talk about what NCFC is up to and what our members are up to. I want to start with the tax reform process that occurred in the first year of the Trump administration in 2017, and how we got to a particular code section that has been a challenge for farmer cooperatives and something that we've spent a lot of time educating and lobbying on for several years now. The tax reform process really we thought was going to start in the first Obama administration. When President Obama took office, we really thought that it would be one of the first things he would tackle. And there were a lot of hearings on the Hill, and a lot of trade associations like NCFC and Chamber of Commerce, and just about every sector of the economy was developing their priorities and thinking that, you know, we were really going to do this because it hadn't been done since 1986. So the tax code had gotten kind of bloated and a lot of things in there that needed to be cleared out. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. President Obama's sort of signature legislation was healthcare, and tax kind of got put on the back burner. But when President Trump took office, one of his things that he wanted to get done in his first year, and notoriously, it's easier to get something done early in an administration. So that was their goal for the first year. And as you might expect, things moved pretty slowly. It's kind of the way things go in Congress these days. And at the end of 2017, as we entered the fall, they began to realize, oh my gosh, we got to hurry if we're going to get this done by the end of the year. And so there began this very rushed process to draft things sort of behind closed doors, not with hearings, and get it through the House, where all tax legislation begins, quickly and without a lot of input. As we were lobbying and trying to get our message across to the Hill, our primary ask was that Section 199 stay in the code for farmer co-ops. And Section 199 is the domestic production activities income deduction. It's a mouthful, but it was put in the code in 2004. It's been around a long time, to promote two things: domestic production, obviously, and jobs. And so because agriculture is sort of the ultimate domestic production, farmer co-ops and farmers were eligible for that. There are a couple of things that make it particularly valuable for farmer co-ops. Because it's a jobs creation provision, it's based around wages. So the deduction is 9% of your domestic production activities income, but it's capped at 50% of wages. So for farmers who probably in most cases don't have on-farm wages that they're paying, or not much, it would be capped at whatever that small amount of your on-farm wages would be. So there's a provision in there for co-ops that allows the co-op to use its wage base to calculate the deduction, so a much larger wage base, and then it's capped at 50% of their wages. And then the co-op passes through the deduction much in the same way that they pass through patronage. So however much business you did with the co-op, you get that deduction. Second thing was unique about it in that it was flexible. The co-op could keep some of that deduction if it needed it at the co-op level. And you'll recall that if there is income that is not passed through, it's taxed at regular corporate rates at the co-op level. So they could choose to keep some of it, or they could pass it all through. And for most marketing co-ops, dairy, almonds, whatever you're marketing, for most, they passed it all through, and it was a really big benefit to farmers. There were some cases where keeping it was a good idea. We had some members in the Midwest that kept a portion of that deduction, used it to help build their balance sheets, and then used it to build infrastructure such as processing plants or grain storage facilities. So it was widely used, really valuable. And so when we were talking to members of Congress, we said that we would like to keep Section 199, that it works really well and it has these unique aspects. But the response that we always got was that, well, we're lowering the corporate rates, so that should be good enough for you, and we're lowering individual rates, and we're getting rid of deductions like 199. In fact, we're going to simplify the code so much that you'll be filing your tax return on a postcard. I don't know about you, but that didn't happen for me. Mine's a little bigger than a postcard. So they didn't quite reach that goal of simplifying the code. As we got closer and closer to the end of 2017 and the bill was about to be unveiled, we learned that we were lobbying on the Senate side, and luckily we had a few champions who were willing to listen to us and to try to address this issue. We learned at the very end of the process that the result was a special deduction for farmer co-ops, or in that anyone who transacted with a co-op would get a deduction equal to 20% of the gross of whatever income they received from the co-op. That meant, profit margins being what they are, that meant if you transacted with a co-op, you would not pay tax. This was more than we had asked for. This was not, we had asked for old Section 199. This was way more. So it was really nice, a nice surprise. But then we quickly realized that it was going to cause a lot of issues for non-cooperative businesses who argued that, you know, why would anyone bring their grain to this private grain elevator if you could get, you know, never pay taxes if you delivered to the co-op. The result was that we entered into negotiation with the private grain interests on how to come to a solution for this drafting error, let's call it. And surprise, surprise, the solution that we all agreed to was what we had asked for all along, which was old Section 199. Again, it had been around since 2004. Regulations implementing it were all understood by farmer co-ops and their members. It seemed like an easy and an elegant way to solve this. And so you'll find that provision in new code section 199A-G6, for those of you who like to pull out your code. And it's unique in that in the code section itself, it directs Treasury to promulgate regulations, quote, based on the regulations applicable to co-ops and their patrons under Section 199 as in effect before its repeal. There are numerous references in the legislative history to former Section 199 and to the underlying regulations. So I don't know how you could have been much clearer as a drafter. I say, we want to put in old 199. So we were really happy with that. This was early 2018 when this provision got in the code. So in June of 2019, we finally saw proposed regulations from Treasury and IRS, and the regulations are what implement this new provision and give instructions on how do you apply it and, you know, calculate your taxes under that section. And we quickly saw that the proposed regulations contradicted that plain language of the statute by eliminating part of the co-op's income, their non-patronage income. Under old Section 199, the co-op took all of its income, whether from patronage or non-patronage sources, and applied the provision to calculate their deduction, limited it to 50% of wages. This, I think, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how co-ops work. The two reasons that we heard for why they did this was that we've lowered the corporate rate, so that should be good enough for you. And primarily, if we allow this deduction on non-patronage income, co-ops are going to expand into all sorts of unrelated activity that's going to compete with private interests out there. Now, never mind that this provision has been around since 2004 and that hadn't happened yet. So if they were going to do this, which seems far-fetched, they probably would have done it by now. And to just give you an example of some of the non-patronage activity that might be included, let's say your co-op has a processing plant and at certain times of the year, let's say you're processing milk into cheese. At certain times of the year, you need more supply than your members can provide, and you source it from non-members. Or let's say you have a grain co-op in the Midwest, and there are some local farmers who just aren't joiners. They don't want to be members of the co-op. Well, you're still going to buy their grain if they would like to sell it to the co-op. So those are kinds of examples of where you might receive non-patronage income. If you look to the purposes of old Section 199, it was domestic production. Those are all domestic production activities. And they're all in service of the mission of the co-op, like Mike was talking about, furthering the interests of the farmer members. If the co-op is able to process its product more efficiently, it serves the members and returns profit to them. So we've been trying to take this message to Treasury, IRS. I think we've met with every possible person we could multiple times to carry this message. We also engaged in lobbying on the Hill. with members of the tax writing committees to try to get them, and they've been very helpful in calling down to Treasury, talking to the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, that's Dave Cotter, and explaining why new Section 199A G6 should look like old Section 199. The last step in that process is for the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to review any regulations that are going to be finalized. And pro tip, you can request a meeting with OMB. This is whether it's tax regulations, environmental, whatever issue you're working on. You can request a meeting and state your case once again to them. And so our thought was, if we could carry our message to them and get them to slow down, maybe withdraw the regs and reconsider them, we might have another chance at fixing this. We also asked our member co-ops to do that, and many of them stepped up and scheduled meetings. And the meetings were a little awkward here in COVID times, because you got to do a conference call with invisible people on the other end and try to make your case. So many of our members did that. We've also met again with Treasury folks over the phone, and we did get them slowed down. I mean, when they go to OMB, it's like they're imminently going to be released, and it's been a couple months now and we haven't seen them yet. We have heard that Treasury is considering an alternative that we have proposed, and also that they've been tied up dealing with the one of President Trump's executive orders on withholding payroll tax. They've been working on those regulations, but they may be ready to turn their attention back to other regulation projects, including ours. And so we think maybe in the next month or so, we might see the final regulations. So what happens if we don't get our wish and they don't fix it and put it back the way it says it should be in the statute? Well, then your next alternative is litigation. And quite frankly, farmer co-ops have been successful in many instances in challenging the IRS interpretation, even under Section 199, and winning in tax court. There are several problems with that. Number one, litigation is very expensive and it's very time consuming. I think one of the 199 cases is getting close to 10 years now. They've been wrangling over that one. So it's costly, it's time consuming, and in the meantime, your co-op and its farmers have uncertainty in their tax planning. So it's not the ideal way to go, but there is, one more option there, and that's litigation. So that's kind of the story of 199A and some of the special provisions for co-ops. And I'm happy to take questions as we get toward the end here. And again, thanks for having me. And I guess I'll turn it back to Mike.
Sounds good. Thank you, Marlis. Really a great deep dive into all the layers that are involved when it comes to how it's more than just how a bill becomes a law. It's how it becomes regulated and how it becomes litigated. So I really appreciate that. And actually, before we go to Paul here, I wanted to do this earlier, but overlooked it. Since we've got a good crew of panelists or participants on the call today, just wanted to see who's all members of a co-op in one way or another here. Actually, first off, we're going to try this out. Bear with us here. I think this will work. But we'll put up a question here. Are you a member of a farmer co-op? So participants, if you're a member of a farmer co-op, click yes. Now, I never was a member of a farmer. My parents were, because we weren't real farmers, but some of our neighbors certainly were members of Bay Lakes Co-op up in northeastern Wisconsin. But anybody out there, a member of a co-op? I will await the results here. I'll give you a minute or two yet. Okay, we've got 6 members of farmer co-ops out there. But I do know that I, at one time, was a member of a rural electric cooperative, O'Connell Electric Cooperative up in northeastern Wisconsin. Anybody out there a member of a rural electric co-op? Click yes or no. I bet we've got more than 6 this time. Let's see. Give them a minute here. I'm going to say 10, maybe 15. Let's see. Oh, I was wrong. Only 5. Okay, well, I guess I overbid there. So glad to hear that, though, and good to know that we've got some co-op members out there on the line. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Paul to hear more about the situation within our ECA. Thanks, Paul. Oh, you're on mute yet, Paul. There you go. Oh, try again. There we go.
Yes. I was trying not to be the one that was muted. Anyway, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Marlis, for kind of explaining a little bit about how we came to being in the tax reform, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. One thing that we should remember that this was actually done under budget reconciliation as well. And what that means is, particularly on the Senate side, where in the Senate, in order to bring legislation to the floor, you have to have a cloture motion. That is, 60 senators have to vote to proceed to debate and moving to legislation. And so with tax reform, the way they did that was under reconciliation. They only needed 51 votes, which they have a majority to do that. So going back to the electric co-ops, we have about 834 distribution co-ops throughout the U.S., about 63 generation and transmission co-ops. We serve 92% of the persistent poverty counties in the U.S., and almost all of our electric co-ops, almost all 900 of them, are federally tax exempt for federal income tax purposes. We pay a lot of sales tax, we pay a lot of property tax, but for federal income tax purposes, we're tax exempt. And we're organized under 501c12 of the tax code, which is benevolent life insurance companies, mutual ditch and irrigation companies, and mutual or cooperative telephone companies, or like organizations, but only if 85% or more of their income comes from their member owners. So you have to have 85% of your income coming from your member owners. That doesn't seem like a big deal. You're on the electric lines, you're paying your electric bill, you're a member, you are generating your income from there, so you should be safe. Well, prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there's a section 118 of the law, which allowed for a contribution to capital. And that contribution to capital included government grants and grants from civic organizations. And those were excluded from income for corporate income tax purposes. Electric co-ops, we are corporations, not-for-profit, member-owned. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually amended Section 118. And what they did is they said a contribution to capital of the taxpayer does not include any contribution by any governmental entity or civic group. So now, if you receive a governmental grant, which includes FEMA reimbursements for storm damage, or if you have a broadband grant, that now is considered income, and the government is not a member of the co-op, so that's non-member income. So now you're going to lose your federal tax exempt status because you receive these grants. And every state has their own cooperative law. So this had further ramifications down the line for individual co-ops. Example, in New York State, if they lost their not-for-profit status, there became a question of whether their electric purchase contract with a public-owned utility was valid because you had to be a not-for-profit, you had to be tax exempt in order to have that contract. So there were some other ramifications. And the thing is, this was really an unintended consequence. The reason behind the change to Section 118 was, in talking to members, was to do away with crony capitalism. It was to address local entities that give money to companies to entice them to move from one jurisdiction to the next. So that, hey, we're going to do some economic development. We want you to move your company into our jurisdiction. We're going to give you a grant. We're going to give you land. And it was never meant as to take away our tax exempt status from what they said. It was never meant to tax FEMA money that was given after a hurricane or tornado or ice storms. And so beginning to look at this, we really started to concentrate, okay, how are we going to get this through? Because this was a very partisan exercise, we knew that we had to get a bipartisan fix that would be able to make it through the Senate process as well. And so we started to look around and look for champions, people that were able to get things done. Senator Portman from Ohio, Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota, both stepped up. And we had actually started this process before the House had flipped. So we went to Adrian Smith from Nebraska and asked him if he would be willing to have the legislation drafted and see if we could get a co-sponsor. Was at a meeting where we talked to Representative Terry Sewell from Alabama, a lot of co-ops down in Alabama. And she said, oh, you know, I work great with Adrian. I would love to be his co-sponsor. So we worked throughout that year to try to get this addressed. And then the House flipped. So now we had, the Democrats in control, and Representative Sewell and Adrian worked really well together. We had this bipartisan group to try to move the legislation. And the reason we chose not to amend Section 118 itself is we knew, because it was a very partisan exercise, because it was done under budget reconciliation, the chance to kind of reverse this was going to be very hard, because then you would bring in other entities that they actually tried to address and tried to prevent kind of, this enticement of giving money to have people come to their jurisdictions. So we ended up drafting our legislation to add a section to the 501c section, which would allow us to receive those governmental grants and not take away our tax exempt status. Knowing that we were really going to have a hard time to get any tax legislation done, we figured that maybe at some point there would be an end-of-year tax package where we would be able to attach our legislation. Doing that, we knew that we were going to have to call on our member co-ops and their individual members to reach out to Congress. So we set up a grassroots campaign to reach down to our member owners, asking them to contact their members of Congress to co-sponsor the Terry Sewell, Adrian Smith bill and the Portman's Tina Smith bill. At the end of the year, we actually had 310 House members sign on to the bill. And on the Senate side, we were up to 56 Senate members that, getting close to that 60 number that could push it down to the floor. Knowing that we would then have to go to leadership and have those members of Congress and those senators talk to leaders to say, look, this is a really important piece of legislation. It's an important provision that we need to be included in any end of year tax provision that goes forward. Even though there was this, hangover due to the way the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act moved through, we built a strong bipartisan case that regardless of how it went through, we need to have a fix. And at the end of the day, there were really only two fixes that were included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020. Ours was one, and the church parking lot issue, which was taxing parking lots of people parking in church parking lots, for lack of a better word. Those two provisions, which was also an unintended consequence when they thought about who they were taking in with this big sweeping reform, were able to get this done. So, it was trying to stay out of the political fray, really picking champions that get things done, and then running up the numbers to show support to leadership. This is something that we need. Like the farmers co-ops, we actually met with Treasury a number of times. Our CEO, Jim Matheson, met with Deputy Secretary of Treasury saying, look, we know this was an unintended consequence. If there's a way to have this income that comes in from the government entities just not be counted as not member income, then you can write your regulations in such a way. And they came back and just simply said, it's written in black and white. We can't stray down that line. What's the next thing that's then not going to be considered not member income? What's going to be then just kind of brushed aside? So we had to get the legislation done, but we had our champions reaching out to Treasury as well. So luckily for us, it was addressed, and the language was pretty clear, and we didn't have to go back to have interpretations from Treasury, which I know Marlis is still dealing with. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it kind of back over to how we were able to get that done.
Sure thing, Paul. Thanks for the history there, and just the how this process and the legislation wended its way through Congress and the administration and the rulemaking process, and how you could find some shortcuts or subvert some of the hurdles that you'd have to clear otherwise. I wanted to go ahead.
And one thing with tax legislation is every time you make a tweak, it means a tweak in the numbers, right? Either positive or negative. So it's not like you're amending enabling legislation where you can make some changes and sure there's going to be cost, but this also have a immediate revenue impact. And so this was one of the things that we did by making this such a narrow fix. Our score was under $27 billion. So it was basically no cost to the government, basically. Hate to say that, but those big numbers, but it's basically in budget terms, didn't have a big impact. So we didn't have to find another revenue source to replace that revenue, which is another big thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is kind of cuts both ways. You want to make the point that what you're working on or the issue is a big deal and thus has a large impact. But then again, for CBO concerns, you want it to have as little of an impact, as small as an impact as possible. So certainly get that. Well, thanks. But for both of you, kind of before we get into some more questions here, there are a few reasons why we wanted to bring this topic, the idea of how co-ops need special attention oftentimes in big legislative efforts. But one of the reasons was because of the success and the kind of the diligent work that NCFC and NRECA have been doing to advocate on behalf of co-ops. Of course, another reason was because these are topics near and dear to the hearts of farmers union members and family farmers, rural residents across the country. But just so that we can dig in more to it, we know that you've got resources online that direct or just kind of summarize and share the process that you've both gone through. I know both NCFC and NRECA have documented this pretty well, but are there any good summaries or any articles or things that either of your organizations have put together about this? I've gotten a couple questions both online and offline about that, and just wanted to know if you could point us to anything that was particularly enlightening.
Yeah, I'll take that one first. We submitted 40 pages of comments on the proposed regulations. They will walk you through the whole story of 199 and 199A, more than you ever wanted to know. But those are available on our website, and if you can't find them, you could reach out to me, and I certainly can get you a copy of that, or an executive summary if you so choose. Something that Paul said reminded me, I did want to say that when he was talking about champions helping you, that's how important that is. And for us, it was Senator Hoeven from North Dakota. He was great, just a real bulldog, would not give up on this issue for us. And so we really appreciated that. And I also wanted to comment, Paul, when you said Treasury reacted and said, well, this is written in black and white, so we can't change it. But for us, it was the opposite. It's just clearly stated, and yet they're taking another interpretation. It's just really drives you crazy.
Yeah, that has to be so frustrating. Yeah, there were a couple of magazine articles in REA magazine that I'll forward. I'll have to pick the links up, but I'll send them to you. That kind of documented how we went about this, and kind of from start to finish.
That'd be great. Yeah, and I think both those links, both the comments, executive summary, and the from the magazine, would be pretty helpful too. Another point that I just wanted to get to the core of a little bit was you both referenced how farmer co-ops or rural electric co-ops are generally tax exempt. And could you discuss a little more of the philosophical rationale behind that, other than like the nuts and bolts reason, like because Congress said so? I'm more interested in like why that's the way it is, and just some of the justifications for that.
Do you want me to take that first, Paul?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think from the rural electric standpoint of going back to FDR, there's just not out in these rural areas, particularly for electricity, there are not a lot of for-profit entities, particularly investor-owned utilities, that are out there maximizing shareholder wealth that are going to serve these areas. There's just not the profit there. So by having our members member-owned and operating basically at cost, it provides, reliable, affordable electricity in other areas that otherwise wouldn't have it. I mean, we're looking at that with broadband now, right? So that it's not that we're not taking in excess revenues, but if we do, we give that back in, a capital credit. So trying to keep that cost low to our members so that they can afford electricity that otherwise they wouldn't have that. And this, dates back to the 1930s. So.
And for farmer cooperatives, there is one type, of course, the tax code has to be complicated. There's one type known as 521 co-ops that are classified as tax exempt, but the vast majority of farmer co-ops are true pass-through entities. So their income is taxed. It's just taxed at the farmer level when the income is passed through. And if the co-op retains anything to, do activities at the co-op level, then that's taxed at regular corporate rates.
Got it. Thanks. That is helpful. And when we talk about farmer member owners of co-ops, at least I always think about it as like the co-op is a collection of farmers, not necessarily an entity. It is an entity. This is why I'm not a tax lawyer, I guess. But I have to think of it in more of a mnemonic or some sort of image to best picture it.
Well, you're right, and we like to say that the co-op is the farmers. I mean, the co-op stands in the farmers' shoes and is operating on their behalf. So,
thank you. That's a much better way of putting it. So, thanks, Marlis. So, and I guess this gets to, oh, Paul, were you chiming in? Oh, sorry. One of the questions that's come in, and I think this goes mostly to Marlis, but kind of the concept of providing a service, like you mentioned, Paul, like a utility or an electric co-op might do. But one of the services might be processing and marketing that farmer co-ops provide. And there's always interest and looking at ways to provide new services and new marketing opportunities to farmers, especially in emerging crops. Hemp is one of those, for instance, with, there's quite the market out there, consumer demand, and making the connection between production and consumer demand is certainly a service that co-ops have provided before and could provide again. Just curious if, from your vantage point, what sort of suggestions or tips would you have for people who are starting to think about that and how to get started on a co-op in today's climate and economy?
yeah, that is a question that has come up, and in fact, we've had at least one conversation with some folks who are processing hemp in Kentucky, and we think it is going to be an emerging market. I think you would be well served to talk to an attorney who is in the practice of forming co-ops and can just give you the pitfalls, some basic advice on what to look for. You definitely need some capital to start up and enough volume to make it worth it. But I think it's definitely a business form that you should be looking at, particularly if you want more of the profits to go to the farmers themselves rather than to some entity. It's also a great way to form a brand name and market under a brand name. Some of the familiar household goods like Welch's and Sunkist and Florida's Natural, Land O'Lakes are all farmer co-ops, and the farmers share in the value of that brand name.
Thanks for that, Marlis. And a lot of there are several centers for cooperatives in state universities across the country, right? There's a few resources like that. I know we could share a link about that, but I'm curious if you had any direction there.
Yeah, there's some very active. Missouri is one that springs to mind. A lot of those Midwestern states have very active university programs. So that would be a good place to turn for more resources and probably free resources.
Well, I think with that, we're kind of at the end of our questions here. And I think this has been a really great opportunity to get some perspective on how we can advocate for and defend co-ops. Even if these weren't necessarily attacks on co-ops, they were ATTACK, not attacks, I guess, as it were. But it ended up being a situation where people who were making decisions didn't have all the information they needed and weren't really aware of the unintended consequences. And then how much effort it takes to push back against that and to make those corrections. I think when a lot of us talk about making a difference in Washington, or having our voice heard, we think about calling our member of Congress, talking to a senator. There ought to be a law and something gets changed. But you both touched on the many different levels and processes that go on before a bill becomes a law and becomes enforced and all that, whether it's legislatively, text, if it's regulatory issues, if it's OMB issues, and then onto the litigation side of things. So I think that's been very helpful for us and for our panelists here, our participants today, to hear more about that. you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to share before I start to wrap things up?
Well, as Paul mentioned, I would also like to mention the importance of having your members engaged, and throughout this whole Section 199 process, they've been valuable in providing us with statistics and just hammering their congressional delegations. And really, that's your best voice, is to have your members contact their slate from Congress. And I'm sure Paul agrees. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. We would have never had the numbers of co-sponsors that we did had it not been for our members on the ground contacting their members of Congress saying, look, this is an important issue. And to your point about cooperation amongst cooperatives, even in some of those places where they weren't doing broadband or did not have a lot of FEMA grants, did not have a lot of government grants, they still wrote in because that was an issue that was going to affect their member co-ops, their associates. So they all pitched in and said, please co-sponsor this bill. Even in members like, California, New York City, where we have no electric co-ops, but reaching out and just explaining that these are issues.
Yeah, that united front on co-ops sure makes a difference. And I think that's one of the things we got to keep in mind as the cooperative principles tell us to do.
Agree.
So before we conclude today, I just wanted to mention a couple things coming up on kind of our series of webinars from National Farmers Union. As I'm sure most of us know here, October is Co-op Month. And we'll be celebrating Co-op Month with 2 live events. First off, Urban Crawl will be hosting a webinar focusing on the cooperative movement and its history. We just barely touched on that today a little bit, but I think it's always good to dive into that more so we understand where we're coming from and where we're going. And then we'll also host a Facebook Live event with 3 panelists, Terrence Courtney, Chris Newman, and Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nevart. They'll discuss how Black farmers have reclaimed economic power through cooperatives. It should be a very interesting discussion and one that we're looking forward to. And we'll announce the dates of those events a little later in September, but keep an eye out for those coming up in October. So as we wrap up, on behalf of the National Farmers Union staff, wanted to thank Paul and Marlis for your time and effort in presenting today and being generous with your time. Really appreciate your insight. And I also wanted to thank everybody for joining in. Once again, you'll be able to find this session online on nfu.org probably within a couple days, and hope you can share it. But once again, thanks everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
And, take care.